If you had tried to explain to a medieval singer what a false relation is, he would have just shaken his head in bewilderment. The rule made sense to him in a completely different way than it does to modern composers. The history of the false relation illustrates a fundamental, sometimes bitterly contested debate about how rules in music should be understood. To do this, we must first go back to ancient Greece before ending up with a composer who liked to provoke his audience with ingenious transgressions of the rules. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato had assumed that behind all manifestations of a thing, such as a chair, there must be a true transcendent idea, for example, that of the true ideal chair. What this means can be read in his famous allegory of the cave. Quite a few Western classical musicians are Platonists. They would like there to be an absolute and true interpretation of a work behind all the real interpretations of pieces of music. And they would prefer a crystal-clear, unchanging system of music theory that would allow them to mercilessly point out all their students' mistakes in composition. A parallel fifth? Wrong. A doubled third in a sixth chord? How wrong can you compose? Far more appropriate for music theory are what Fred Lerdahl and Ray Jackendoff call preference rules in their book Generative Theory of Tonal Music. Not instructions that distinguish between right and wrong, but indications of what is more or less recommended. In music there is no right or wrong, only judgments of taste that seem more or less appropriate depending on the era, individual preferences, and styles. Most rules of harmony and counterpoint are not the result of ingenious analysis of a God-given world harmony, but rather evidence of historical practice, as evidenced by the false relation rule. Arnold Schoenberg sums up this rule and its relativization in his theory of harmony. He writes, "The rule of dissonance states that the chromatic augmentation or diminution of a tone must occur in the same voice in which the tone had not previously been augmented or diminished." Schoenberg pointed out that the law cannot be applied in its full strictness because practice too often contradicts it. Before his time, the opposite law even applied, which required that the chromatic raising of a tone never be represented in one voice. Where did Schoenberg get the latter from? No idea. If anyone knows, please write it in the comments. Both laws are not laws of beauty, Schoenberg continues, but two different attempts to overcome intonation difficulties. Singing a chromatic semitone in tune is not that easy. Schoenberg is right. The false relation rule was initially established for very practical reasons. With the transition from monophony to polyphony, medieval singers faced new problems. The most significant was that their melodic singing was no longer free, but came into tension with the singing of others. When singing in unison, singers only had to intonate correctly interval by interval, whereby progressing in fifths or octaves was easier than in thirds and sixths. The tritone was and is the most difficult to sing. The awkward interval was therefore referred to as the diabolus in musica by frustrated singers. Every choir singer experiences that in polyphonic vocal music, the other voices either help or hinder them in finding and intonating their own voice. The most difficult thing is to find a note that was sounded immediately before in another voice, but in an altered form, i.e., chromatically changed. Not only is the security provided by harmony lacking, but the note that sounded differently in the other voice hinders the singer's ability to find their own note. The phenomenon is comparable to annoying friends who deliberately mumble wrong numbers when you are trying to remember a series of numbers, such as a phone number. They constantly throw you off balance. The difficulty of singing in false relation can be illustrated by the example of Thomas Tallis' five-part motet O Nata Lux from 1575, a work from the late Renaissance when tonality did not yet have a cadential character. In the last bar, the second tenor goes from E flat to F and the soprano from G to F sharp, but relatively harmlessly in the form of a closing formula. A chromatic approximation from below. If you take the tenor line on its own, you would expect a half cadence in E flat major. The soprano alone suggests G minor. Together, the two voices clash quite a bit. Listen to recordings on YouTube and decide for yourself how confidently vocal ensembles intonate this passage. The false relation can be used artistically as a cumbersome, irritating stylistic device of chromaticism. The southern Italian Carlo Gesualdo became famous for this in the Renaissance. Take, for example, his 5-part madrigal Moro Lasso. It begins with excessive chromaticism. The bass and soprano are led chromatically downwards in parallel major thirds. The alto and tenor have a melody in parallel fourths. In the 6th bar, the soprano sings a G sharp on the word pain. Immediately after the bass has intoned a G. An E major chord follows immediately after a G major chord. Gesualdo did not yet think in terms of cadential tonality structures. However, the example shows that the false relation contradicts correct voice leading when changing from one key to another. Incidentally, there is a false relation variant that regulates the problematic use of the tritone. In this case too, the departure from correct modulation practice ultimately plays a role. The tritone becomes part of a whole tone scale that breaks with tonality. With the advent of cadential harmony, the false relation rule transformed from a vocal relief into a symptom of discordant lines when changing keys. The change from one key to another is not a mechanical process carried out according to a Platonic rulebook, but rather a testament to creative invention. This is also evident in the confusing, sometimes contradictory information about when a false relation should be avoided and when it should be unproblematic. In a musical lexicon from 1865, for example, we read, "In many cases that cannot be determined by a general rule, false relation sounds bad, while in others it is considered unproblematic by the best composers." The ancients avoided it altogether in 2-part settings, and in polyphonic settings only in the outer voices, while allowing it in the middle voices. Matheson says about this, because it is of little importance in full voice settings, the rule does not have to be followed rigorously. Ultimately, it is the composer's good taste that decides. Mozart is no less a master than Gesualdo. He makes use of chromaticism and the expressiveness of the false relation, for example, at the beginning of his dissonance quartet. An A-flat major and A-D major 7th chord collide, resulting in the false relation, strongly accentuated by the A-flat in the viola to the A in the violin. If you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel. At academia-larty.org, you will also find a knowledge database and online courses from our academy. And check out the other videos here on YouTube. Thank you for your interest.